So my friends, this weekend we hear the gospel of Martha and Mary, which actually follows directly from the gospel we had last week of the Good Samaritan, because if you remember last week, a scribe asked, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus replies, you shall love the Lord your God with your heart, being, strength, and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Or rather, the scribe replies, and Jesus says you answered correctly. So love God and love your neighbor. And then the scribe says, okay, but who's my neighbor? And then we got the parable of the Good Samaritan, which tells us it's an exemplification of love of neighbor. But then right after that, we get the story of Martha and Mary, which is an example of love of God. What does it mean to love God? With your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. Now, Martha, oftentimes in this gospel, Martha is presented as the villain, right? She's the one that did something wrong and needs to be corrected because she's burdened and anxious about much serving. And Jesus says Mary chose the better part. We can't read this gospel in terms of right and wrong because we hear that they both, Martha and her sister Mary, and we know that their brother Lazarus lives with them, they welcome Jesus into their home. So we are already in the win category, right? They've already won by welcoming Jesus. We've already, it's all good from here, and now it's just a matter of good or better, right? So welcoming Jesus is the right first step, and you have to do that. But then, generally, when we welcome Jesus, we then act according to our temperament. And so, some people act like Martha, burdened, anxious. Another one says anxious, worried about many things. There's a lot of work to do. Others of us can act like Mary, where we are able to sit at the Lord's feet and have that quiet of prayer. I'm sure there'll be homilies elsewhere in the country that are like, we're both Martha and we're all both like, if you met me, I'm hardcore Martha, right? I would not advise anyone to call me Father Martha later, but I mean, if you did, it would almost fit. It's like I am a hardcore Martha. We welcome Jesus in our community, but man, it takes a lot of work to welcome him, right? It takes a lot. But Mary chose the better part, right? The sister Mary, she chose the better part because when we welcome Jesus, do we get distracted with all the stuff that we have to do for him? Like Jesus isn't there for the meal. He's not going to, restaurant Martha and Mary. He's there to spend time with them because he loves them. So when we welcome Jesus because he loves us, and he wants to spend quality time with us. That's definitely one of Jesus' love languages, right? Jesus wants to spend quality time with us. Do we spend time with him? Or do we just want to get right to work? Even good work. Prayer, time with Jesus, is the most important thing we can do in the course of a day. To have time with Jesus every day. It's the most important thing we can do. It also is, ironically, it's the most practical thing we can do. The most practical thing we can do when there's a need, the first and most practical thing we do is to pray, to bring it to Jesus. That's the multiplication of the loaves and the fish, right? The big crowd, and Jesus says to Philip, where can we get enough food to feed all these people? And Philip, good pastor, does the calculation. How much is it going to cost? Jesus, we need at least 200 days' wages for everyone to have a little. But that's not what he's looking for. Jesus, give me what you have. And then he's the one that feeds the crowd. Prayer is the most important. And we, if our lives are busy, or even when they're not busy, to take that time for prayer is the most important thing we can do, particularly when we're busy. Two stories about that, one far away and one very, very local. So the far away story is back in the early days of the Missionaries of Charity founded by Mother Teresa. They're doing work with the poor in Calcutta, and things are really kind of getting started up, right? They're really going. And the Missionaries of Charity would make a holy hour every day. So every day in the midst of all the stuff that they have to do, they would take an hour of prayer, usually first thing in the morning, an hour of prayer in the presence of Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament, a full holy hour every single day. And they take that hour for prayer. And as you know, there was more and more needs and more people to feed and more people to clothe and more people that were dying that they needed to tend to. One of the sisters came up to Mother Teresa and said, "Mother, we are too busy. We can't, there's so much needs. We can't, the holy hour isn't working anymore because we're too busy. We can't do this. There's not enough time in the schedule to do the holy hour." And Mother said, "You're right. We're too busy. We need to do 2 holy hours." And so to this day, the Missionaries of Charity all over the world spend an hour in prayer every morning, usually around 5 in the morning, and then an hour in prayer every afternoon, usually from 4 to 5 in the afternoon, even with how busy they are, because Mother Teresa, a saint, recognized that prayer is the most important thing and it's the most practical thing we can do. The local example is me this week. Earlier this week, I was pretty stressed about a number of things, particularly that hall right next door, which needs to be abated. That's why you see those wooden benches outside. It needs to be fully abated. We thought we'd be able to cover it. We're not able to. So it's got to be fully abated, asbestos containment, the whole kind of thing. The budget just went decently up to do the project. Not only that, because of all the hazardous materials we're dealing with, for a little while there on Monday morning, it looked like the whole project wouldn't be done until the end of August or early September. And we have groups that need to start using it by mid-August. So I was having a bad day on Monday, and I was pretty frustrated. And so what do, Martha? Right? I'm going to make as many phone calls as I can about this. I'm going to be there talking, what can we do? How can we change the price? How can we get in there sooner? Can we do this? Can we do that? Ultimately, it's going to put me in a bad mood. And so I left the office in a bad mood and anxious and worried about many things. And my solution, as was maybe recommended to me by some people that work for us, was to drive home listening to heavy metal hard rock and just try to drown out. Let's just drown out the chaos. So that's what I did. I drove home listening to heavy metal hard rock, and maybe everything will work out if I could just manage the situation enough. Meanwhile, someone else who works for us decided to pray. I think prayed the Divine Mercy Chaplet. The solution was done by the end of the day, right? So we can either pray about it, which is the most practical thing we can do, or we can stress and worry about it. So then later in the week, another thing came up. I'm leaving for vacation tomorrow. I'll be gone for the next 2 weeks. If you haven't noticed, we still don't have a second priest. So the daily masses, all the funerals, of which we've already got 2, and there'll be more coming. And some of the things, Monsignor Matera is going to do the lion's share of the work, but there's more needs. And so on Wednesday or Thursday, I think it was on Thursday, it's okay, we have another funeral, we have a mass that needs to be covered, we have this and that, all while I'm supposed to be away. And so I must send out 11 text messages to different priests asking for help, and after a little while, no one was responding. So my stress is going way up. And why don't I pray the Divine Mercy Chaplet, right? So I did. I prayed the Divine Mercy Chaplet, and then I prayed my Liturgy of the Hours, and by the time I finished both of those, everything was covered. Everything was said. Prayer is the most practical thing we can do. And when we think we have to manage it all, that time with Jesus is not only the most important, but it's the most practical thing we could do. All right, here's a final point as we consider Martha and Mary, as it can particularly relate to us, because each one of us, no matter how busy we are, should make time for prayer every day. But in a more, physical way, Martha and Mary both receive Jesus into their home, but then one gets right to work and one sits and spends time with him. Every time we come to Mass that we receive Holy Communion, we receive Jesus not into our home, but into our own bodies. And then the question is, once he's there, which already puts us in the win category, what do we do? I must say, with our parish, I don't really look for it, but I don't notice a huge crowd of people walking out after communion. And thank goodness, because that's the wrong thing to do. But even when Mass ends, right, we say the vocation prayer and then we have the recessional. It's a great practice. If you're able to, it's a great practice. We've received Jesus in our body. And maybe we do have to get to work. Maybe we have stuff we want to do. Maybe we're looking forward to eventually when the hall is done, having donuts again and coffee. And there's a day to get about. But can we spend, like Mary, just a few moments? 10 seconds, 30 seconds. When Mass ends and the priest and deacon walk out, could we maybe just sit back down or kneel down just for a few seconds and just say thank you? And just spend that little bit of time with Jesus. Not to get right back to work. There's work to do and we'll get there. But we've received Jesus into our body. And so to make a little thanksgiving, it's not required, you don't have to do it. But it's the generosity of the love. Jesus wants to spend time with us. So after Mass, if it's possible, for just a few seconds or a minute or two, just to be able to be seated or kneel down and just spend that moment with Jesus, right? Because we've received him and now we want to spend time with him. That's the better part. And so that's a small practical way that each one of us could try to practice if we're able, just to have that little bit of time, right? Those few seconds or the minute or two, just to spend that time with Jesus and be able to be there with him. So let's ask St. Martha and St. Mary to pray for us, right? Let's really ask that we can imitate them, whether we have the work to do or the time for contemplation. Prayer is the most practical thing. Jesus wants to spend time with us, and we can find these little times each day, particularly after receiving Holy Communion. We just spend those moments with Jesus in prayer and contemplation, which is the better part.